Hello and welcome back to All You Need Notes for Edexcel IGCSE History, and this is the second video in the USA series from 1918 to 41, which will help you for your Paper 2 Part 1 questions. And this video is on the increased social tensions in the 1920s. So the first feature then of attitudes and policies towards immigration is that people feared immigrants. So there was a fear that Eastern Europeans, Catholics, Jews, communists, all these people who were migrating to America, there was a fear amongst Americans that they were radicalised, that they were taking American jobs, that they were trying to overthrow capitalism. There was intense fear of this. And these immigrants were often poor, unable to speak English, and so they passed laws against them. So, for example, the 1921 Emergency Quota Act restricted immigration numbers to 357,000 per year. So this showed that people feared them, they didn't want them in America, and they wanted to stem the flow of immigrants going into the US. The second feature is that the number of immigrants was reduced. So in 1924, the National Origins Act was passed, and this meant that people who were migrating to America, they were counted, and America only allowed 2% of the number of immigrants from each particular country that lived in America in 1890. So they go in the records, they'd find the number of people who lived in America from different places of origin in 1890, and only 2% of that number were then allowed to come into America in 1924. So this severely restricted the number of immigrants. It also meant that the countries that had immigrated to America most in 1890 had more people then who could migrate into America in 1924, and the countries that weren't migrating into America at that point, a lot fewer people were allowed into America in 1924. Also, enforcement like border control meant that a lot more people were stopped from entering America, so the number of immigrants went down massively. So in 1929, only 280,000 migrants came into America, and this went down from 1 million in 1914. So America, which had been a country where a lot of people could migrate to, where you could come from anywhere to join and help to grow this country, became much more constricting on how many people were allowed to come into it. The second thing to look at then is the Palmer Raids and the Red Scare. So the first feature of this is that communists were feared. So in 1917 there was a Russian Revolution where a lot of communists came in and overthrew and kicked out and killed the old Russian aristocracy. And this was reported all over the world, and many Americans who were capitalists and so feared communism were very, very scared to let immigrants into America because they could be communists too and could be about to overthrow the rich in America. And to show this, in 1919, for example, there were 3,600 strikes organised by workers, and 40 mail bombs were sent to politicians, including Palmer. And this showed that there was some activity against employers and politicians, and people feared that this was caused by communists who were going to try to overthrow America and push communism into America. So people were scared of this. A second feature is that there were raids on radical groups, and this is the Palmer Raids. So the General Intelligence Division at the time, they spied on and they arrested any radicals they could find between 1919 and 20. And they deported 600 radicals. They arrested many others. They tried to stop all the people who might be about to overthrow capitalism in America. They also increased support. There was general increased support for restrictions on immigration, further to ones we've seen before. So you've got the Emergency Quota Act again, things like that to stop the number of immigrants coming into America. Those were passed because of the Palmer Raids. And this weakened the power of trade unions. They also tried to weaken their power, especially if they had communist members. The next one is quite interesting. This was examined in the 2022 paper, so it is popular with Edexcel, and this is the Sacco and Vanzetti case. So the first feature of the Sacco and Vanzetti case is that these two immigrants, Sacco and Vanzetti, were feared. So they come from Italy, and on the 5th of May 1920 they were arrested because they had picked up a car which had been involved in the shooting of a guard and a paymaster at a local factory. So they were suspected of perhaps shooting them, and they were suspected of crime. They also had previous links to anarchism and to the Palmer bombs, so the bombs that were sent to politicians, these mail bombs, and they were feared as anti-capitalists. A second feature is that Sacco and Vanzetti were executed. So even though they both had alibis, they had evidence that they were elsewhere when the crime allegedly took place, they were found guilty a year later, and they were sentenced to death by electrocution. And they were executed in 1927, even after loads of protests all the world over, including in their own Italy. And the person who judged the trial, he was a known anti-anarchist, so perhaps they could have been innocent, and there was a lot of evidence skewed against them, and the judge was most likely to have said that they were guilty. We don't know for sure what happened in that, but it is an interesting case to show how immigrants were really, really feared and how there was a lot of prejudice against them. The next thing to look at then is the attitudes towards Black Americans. So the first feature is that Jim Crow laws segregated society. So Black people had different toilets from white people, they had to dine in different parts of the restaurant, in different railway carriages, so all over public transport. They had different schools, different churches, and this was even more potent in the southern states, which more heavily feared people who weren't American, and also Black people as well. There was a lot of prejudice against people who weren't Christian, people who weren't white, people who weren't Anglo-Saxon white Americans. So this made Black people, immigrants, etc., more at risk of racist violence. So racism became normalised in the society there, and there were many beatings and lynchings of Black people that happened in these states. The second feature is that Black Americans had a lower quality of life compared to white Americans. So even after the liberation of slaves, which had happened a few decades before, Black people were still seen as second-class citizens. They worked in unskilled jobs like farm labour, and many tried to move to the northern states to have a better quality of life, so they settled in places like Harlem, and in order to escape the race riots and the dreadful living standards in the South. Linked to that is the Ku Klux Klan. So the first feature of this is that they believed in white supremacy. So they'd been inspired by the 1915 film called Birth of a Nation, and they saw Black people as evil. They thought that white supremacists were heroes, and so this organisation grew, completely unfounded. It was based on a film, and they lynched and beat Black people, especially in the southern states in America. They thought that Anglo-Saxon Protestants were superior, and they should help purify America to stop Jews, to stop immigrants. The second feature is that they grew in political power. So by 1923 they had 5 million members, and they were supported by the middle class. They had a lot of sympathisers and even members amongst the police, in politics and in law courts. So it was very, very hard to try and convict against them. They had a lot of leeway and a lot of power that was institutionalised in America. And they even performed a protest in Washington in 1925. They argued against equality. They were very much against America being liberalised and allowing a lot of equality between Black people and white people. The next thing to look at is the monkey trial. The first feature of this is that there was differences between fundamentalists and Darwinists. So fundamentalists were a group who took everything in the Bible literally. So when it says that God created the world in 7 days, they thought that means God created the world in 7 days. They thought that when it said God created humans, out of the earth, that he literally did create them out of the earth, and he made them perfect completely. And these Christians wanted to preach these values, these what they thought were correct. However, modernists wanted to reinterpret the Bible. So they'd seen evidence, for example, in Darwin's theory of evolution, that humans weren't created perfectly in the very beginning, but that they had evolved into their current form. But a lot of these traditional fundamentalists had power. And so, for example, in Tennessee, the teaching of evolution was completely banned as part of the Butler Act. So there was a conflict between what science supported and what these Christian fundamentalists interpreted the Bible as. The second feature is that John Scopes' trial raised awareness of this religious debate. So in order to try and test this law, an organisation made Scopes teach about evolution and got one of the students to report it in 1925, and he was put on trial then. His lawyer, called Darrow, challenged this law and tried to say that it was silly and that it didn't make sense, it wasn't scientifically backed up. And so this put creationism versus modernism in the courts. So was evolution a thing? And what should America believe in? Scopes was fined himself. He was found guilty of teaching about evolution, but it was reported all over America. It was on the radio, it was in newspapers, and he was mocked. The law was mocked in a lot of newspapers, in a lot of political cartoons. They were saying how ridiculous to believe this when science is behind evolution. So this just shows the complete split across American society between the traditional values and the modern interpretations, something that we saw in the previous video with the Roaring Twenties. So, for example, the changing role of women as flappers, and people were very against that. So there was a new America, new values, new ideas, new society emerging, but there were a lot of people who wanted to hold that back. And we'll see this with the Prohibition as well, and the gangsters. So the first feature of this was that it was harder to get alcohol. So the 18th Amendment was passed, and this banned the manufacture and distribution of alcohol. So it banned alcohol across America, essentially, in the hope that people would be more healthy, they would have a better family life, there would be less divorces, etc. So this was an idea imposed by traditional Christians who tried to say that alcohol was a bad thing for society and that it ruined a lot of lives. And so the best thing to do would be to ban it. Whereas more modern young Americans were drinking a lot, they were smoking a lot of young women were drinking and smoking as well. And this was frowned upon by the older people who tried to ban and outlaw it entirely. And thousands of jobs were lost because of this. So there was less need for wheat to make alcohol, for example. And so farmers suffered because they didn't have to provide as much of that. But people didn't just stop there. They didn't just give up alcohol if they wanted it. They tried a variety of different things. So they went to speakeasies, which were informal, illegal pubs which were set up across the major cities in America, where you could go, you could dance, you could drink, you could listen to music, but crucially, you could drink. It was illegal, and this alcohol wasn't produced at all legally. There was also people making what they called moonshine. So this was homemade alcohol. It was often dangerous because it wasn't regulated. So a lot of people actually became ill because they wanted alcohol, they tried to get it, and because the law outlawed any proper production of alcohol in America, they were having to resort to this potentially poisonous alcohol. And also gangs used to smuggle it in from Canada, from other countries, which was called bootlegging. The second feature of this is that organised crime grew. So Prohibition and the gangsters are very linked because gangs grew larger. They were having to distribute a lot more alcohol. A lot of people who had normally been middle class, who wouldn't have even thought about being involved with crime, were now actively encouraging almost and being part of crime because they were buying this illicit alcohol. They were allowing these gangs to keep smuggling it in from other countries. And Al Capone, who was head of one gang, he earned $105 million a year from his variety of different activities, so smuggling alcohol, also organising brothels, gambling. So there was a lot of money, illicit money, that was created as part of these gangs. And as you can imagine, they could use that money to bribe people, to bribe the police, to bribe the courts, in order to make sure that they were well protected. So organised crime definitely did grow. And alongside this, because these gangs operated outside the law, a lot of violence increased as well. So 200 people were murdered in Chicago by November 1924, because these gangs were carrying around guns and knives, and they were attacking other gangs. And that is the end of this All You Need Notes video for the Edexcel IGCSE history course on the USA from 1918 to 41 free paper 2 exam. Thank you very much for watching, and if you enjoyed it, please do like and subscribe and comment if you found it helpful. Thank you. Goodbye. Bye.